This wasn't said directly to me. This was on a podcast, and I can't tell you how many people I've shared this with. So this pastor said, speaking of validating and believing her, he said, "It's fair to expect your spouse has eyes only for you. It doesn't matter how sexualized our culture has become. It is fair. I believe a God-given desire in a marriage relationship to say, I want to be the only one you look at or see in that way." And there's the tears. So don't buy into the cultural garbage that says that's just what guys do, or boys will be boys, sowing their wild oats. It is fair for you, betrayed spouse, to expect that you will be honored by your husband's thoughts and actions. Like, stop, my ears are bleeding.
What nobody knows, Kris, and particularly you, is that I just hit record.
You did not.
I did hit record, but it was after you were singing. So Today, Kris and I are actually talking about 1980s.
That's rude. You totally...
I did not record it.
That's illegal. You can't record me without my express written permission or knowledge.
I forged it. I didn't record you singing, but today Kris and I are talking about 1980s Christian music. And, you know, many of our friend group actually did not grow up with Christian music in the 80s because not everyone grows up in a Christian home. However, Kris and I have discovered we have grown up in Christian homes, and we know all the same... Oh, I shouldn't say hokey. They probably weren't hokey at the time.
Oh, no, they're great.
Oh, no, they're not. They're terrible. They're just...
Oh, come on. Shine, Jesus, shine. I love you, Lord.
Okay,
that's love you, Lord, and I lift my voice. Classic. It's classic.
That was classic, and actually makes a comeback every now and then.
Great is the Lord.
Praise the Lord. But I'm thinking of things like I am a C, I am a CH, I am a CH.
I am a CHRISTIAN.
Yeah, all these, yeah. Uh-huh. So we have like all these childhood things that we that we occasionally...
Lord, I lift your name on high.
No, that's terrible. The hand movements are pretty solid,
to our God. I exalt thee. Wow.
Okay, now that one. Okay, let's just do a pause there. I exalt thee is a generational song. However, it expands all the generations. That is a fantastic song. And today's guest on today's podcast is someone. He's actually my former boss, and there were times in the office that he and I would connect on some of these older songs because not everybody knows them. And I was always pretty impressed that almost always he knew the song. And turns out that he's actually a pretty decent singer himself, and his name is Nick Stumbo. And we invited Nick to be on the podcast today because not only is he the executive director at Pure Desire, he is also a former pastor. He has a pastor's heart.
I mean, once a pastor, always a pastor, right?
Yeah. And I think at one point he even, I don't know if we were recording at this point, but he makes a statement that we're all pastors. And that's a little bit of a glimpse into his heart. He is a incredibly humble and gracious man who came on the podcast today to talk about a topic that you and I had discussed, actually that we spoke at a Lunch and Learn previously last year. And the subject's pretty tough because we're addressing pastors and where they've missed the mark, or maybe not just pastors, but church leadership, and where they've missed the mark in regard to walking alongside a betrayed spouse.
And then we talk about how we can all do it better. So that Brené Brown quote that you bring up in the recording is, is it Brené Brown? I think it's Maya Angelou. Do the best you can with what you have, and when you know better, do better. So we give some examples of women who have written into us, or gals that we know who had shared their experience where it was hurtful, where a pastor was trying but was ill-equipped or maybe misinformed, and they actually ended up doing some damage, adding insult to injury in the situation. So we based this talk that we gave off of a first responder. So how would a first responder treat someone with a brand new traumatic wound, boots on the street, if they were, real life fire service or paramedic, if they showed up on the scene of an accident, someone been run over by a car, and they've got a traumatic wound, broken limbs, what would they do? And then we correlated what a first responder would do to treat that severe wound with what we can do as first responders when it comes to supporting a betrayed spouse well. So now in the beginning of this conversation, we want all of you to know that we want to acknowledge a few things, that Jenn and I are betrayal recovery coaches, and we work with women who want help. They've sought us out because they want to move forward, and we acknowledge that pastors oftentimes are dealing with a mixed bag. They are probably dealing with people who don't want help, or they're overwhelmed with emotions, and so that's tough. And pastors do have a tough job. They're wearing a lot of hats, and the truth is, pastors don't have to wear all the hats. They're not in this alone either, just as we are not as betrayed spouses. And so we want to help support pastors as they help others by providing resources and building a bridge and being the conduit. We don't have to have all the answers. We just need to know who does and how to get the people that are hurting to those resources.
Yeah. We also want to acknowledge that a lot of the testimonies that you're going to hear today might actually be very difficult to hear. So we want to acknowledge that not every one of these testimonies will necessarily apply to you as the listener. However, after working in this field, really for the last 18 years, these are stories that we have really heard over and over. These stories have come from well-meaning pastors, church leadership, friends, family, colleagues, and mentors. And we brought Nick on today as an expert in the field and also as a recovering addict. So we couldn't think of anyone better than to speak on this subject than Nick Stumbo.
Yeah. With that quote, do the best you can with what you have, and when you know better, do better. He is a great example of that. Mm-hmm. He is doing it so well now, both in his recovery journey and process, but also as a pastor and a mentor, leading other pastors, mentors, and friends and family to support both the addict and the betrayed spouse well. Yeah,
he's one of the most humble guys I've ever known, and what you see with Nick is what you get. So enjoy today's podcast. If you are listening and are really looking for some content to give someone who does not know how to respond, this would be an excellent podcast to give to them and have them listen to.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, friends. Welcome to the Betrayal Recovery Transformation Podcast. This is your place to reclaim your life after betrayal. I'm your host, Kris Rocha, and I'm here with my co-host, Jenn Howie. Hey, Jenn.
Hello. I almost said good morning, everyone, and then realized, hey, that's not really a thing here. Well, it could be for some of you that might be listening in the morning, but here we are. It's morning over here in Bend, Oregon, and wherever you're listening, we are just so glad that you are here. We're excited for how expansive this podcast has become, and we just want you to know that wherever you are physically, we're here with you spiritually, emotionally, and in prayer in your journey. On today's podcast, I have to say, I always say I'm really excited about the podcast, maybe just because I'm excited about the podcast that we do, but today we have a third generation pastor, Nick Stumbo, and he started his ministry career at East Hill Alliance Church in Kelso, Washington. And he served there as our lead pastor for more than a decade. And Nick observed the fallout of sexual brokenness and the devastation in the lives of men and women in the church. And he recognized, like never before, the need for a culture of grace in the church. Confronted with his own pornography addiction, Nick and his wife, Michelle, found hope and healing through the counseling and the group ministries of Pure Desire. It radically changed his life, and his public disclosure to his church body led to a revival of forgiveness and healing. Nick has authored 2 books, Setting Us Free and Safe, and Nick is now the executive director of Pure Desire Ministries and my favorite former boss, clearly his most extinguished title.
We have a trophy for you, Nick, after the show. We'll get that to you. Small plaque and a trophy for that.
Jenn's former boss.
The Dealing with Jenn trophy, or No, those were
Actually,
good days. We had a good time together, Jenn.
one could say that for sure. But yes, those were good days, and really are in many ways. Is really all three of us continue to move toward the calling that God has put on each of our lives to bring hope and healing to women. So it's been an honor to really to work with you, Nick, and to continue that work that God is doing here today. So with that, Kris, talk to us.
Yeah. So today we invited Nick in for a very important conversation. So grateful, Nick, that you were able to join us for this. And we're going to be talking about how pastors and clergy can come alongside a betrayed spouse well. Jenn and I gave a presentation last year to a group of pastors, and as I was preparing for it, the Holy Spirit said, hey, why don't you use first responders as a metaphor for this? I was in the fire service for 12 years, so I worked with a lot of paramedics and EMTs and got to see what their boots on the street look like day in and day out. And so we're going to start off with a few statistics from The Healing Church, a book that Sam Black wrote. He's with Covenant Eyes. And Jenn, if you would share those statistics with us, that'd be great. And then we'll get started on how we can be first responders and come alongside someone who suffered a traumatic wound, such as betrayal trauma, well.
Thanks, Kris. All right, so here we go. 2/3 of men who regularly attend church struggle with porn. 1/3 of women also who regularly attend church struggle with pornography. 69% of pastors say that porn has adversely affected their church, but only 7% of churches offer any kind of support and resources for that. So this is where those who are listening, all of us really, have the opportunity to affect these statistics positively. And that's what we're here to talk about today. How do we come alongside people in this process in ways that are effective and healing for everyone who is either struggling with pornography or have been a part of the effects of someone else's addiction with pornography.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jenn. All right, so let's get into this. So when a paramedic shows up on a scene of a critical accident and someone has sustained a traumatic wound, just picture, broken bones, bleeding, it's bad. It's pretty devastating. The first thing a paramedic is going to do is assess the severity of the wound. So with this metaphor, with betrayal trauma, how do we do that as first responders if a woman's reached out to us and she's found out there's been unwanted sexual behavior in her marriage? The way that we can assess the severity of the wound is by listening to her. So we asked several women to write us with some of their experiences, and we selected some quotes. So we've got a quote here from Julie B., and her experience was, it says, "How can the church learn to help marriages in recovery? I appreciate the encouragement and prayer, but they seem so ill-equipped in the area of infidelity. The other day in conversation with my pastor, he tried to dance around the words, quote, affair and infidelity. When I said we call it infidelity because that's what it was, he said I was being unforgiving and needed to stop hurting my husband by using those words. He meant well. I know he did. Pastors are often the first responders in these situations, yet as well-meaning as they are, many of them have no clue how to help a woman experiencing betrayal trauma." So thank you for sending that in to us, Julie. And so with that, I'm going to ask Nick to jump in. What are your thoughts, Nick, on how can we listen well?
Yeah, I think one of the key parts of that phrase is it's assessing her wound and the impact on her, because I think we're really quick to jump to, well, what was the behavior, or how should we treat this in the marriage in general, without really listening and understanding the impact that has had on the betrayed spouse. And I think throughout the podcast, we're going to use her or she for the betrayed spouse and he or him for the struggler or the addict. And I just want to say up front, like, it's not always the male addict that women struggle too. And there are situations where a woman has had an affair or acted out and the man is feeling the betrayal. But I think for the nature of our podcast, if we use he and her, it's because that is more common or more frequently what pastors are addressing. And so I would just share briefly a little bit of my story. I was really attempting to be a man of integrity early in my marriage, even while I was stuck in a binge purge struggle with pornography. And in that integrity, I would go to my wife, I would confess that it had happened again, tell her how sorry I was. And one of the phrases I would use that made sense to me was, hey, this isn't about you. This is a problem that I've had long before I met you. I'm working really hard to stop, and it keeps happening. I'm so sorry, but it's nothing to do with you. And so you shouldn't feel that hurt, right? Like trying to help her understand, if she just saw it the way I saw it, that she wouldn't feel that hurt because she know it wasn't about hurting her. And for 10 years, that was the kind of language I used with my wife. And really, our transformation couple came as a result of partly, I think, God revealing to me that I had the equation backwards, that I was trying to tell my wife how she should feel versus listening to her about how it was impacting her.
Wow.
Because she was also using phrases like, an affair. And she understood it's not the same as a physical affair, but she would say, it feels to me like you're having an affair. This feels like you're cheating on me. And it wasn't until I started to listen to her and take her experience honestly and truthfully for what it was that I was willing to enter into the kind of change that we needed. And I remember at that time, writing down in a journal, like, if there was any other area of my life where my wife told me, when you do this, I feel like you're cheating on me, that I wouldn't have moved heaven and earth to try to change that behavior. If she said, when you overeat, it feels like you're cheating on me, or when you go to the store and I don't know where you've left. It like any of the other behavior, if she said it feels this way to me, I'd be like, I never want you to feel that way. I will make changes. And yet there was this area of my life where I was so steeped in rationalizing or minimizing the behavior that I wasn't willing to listen to how hurtful it was to her. And I think that was a big part of it too, that I didn't want to have to accept how much I was hurting my wife. And if I valued or invalidated her experience, it meant I was really doing this to her. But honestly, that's what I needed to receive in order to enter into change. And I share that story for pastors because I think we may come from a perspective, often male pastors who understand men well and kind of understand fantasy and lust. And they may be a little bought into some of that idea of, well, if you just understood it's not about you, you shouldn't be that mad. But I would say I would hope we could all recognize it's not our job to tell someone else how they should feel.
Good. Yeah.
And when we do that, that doesn't usually go very well, does it? Like if I call someone a whole bunch of names and then they say, man, Nick, when you said those names of me, that was really hurtful. It wouldn't be right for me to respond and say, oh, you shouldn't be hurt. I'm going to tell you how to feel. You shouldn't be hurt because I don't want you to be hurt. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, no, that my job in that situation would be to receive, oh, my words hurt you and were impactful in a very negative way. I need to own that. I need to apologize for it. And I need to work to amend my ways so that I don't leave you feeling that way. And that's, I think, the case with a betrayed or hurting spouse is we need to assess her wound. Like, what is it doing to her? And you guys have probably discussed it on your podcast, but not every marriage is the same and not every woman will react the same. And the level of trauma, the perceived sense of betrayal, the level of broken trust may be very different person to person, marriage to marriage. And I've definitely worked with couples where the man's level of acting out, if we could say, was maybe not that severe, but because of issues maybe from her family of origin or how it connected to other trauma, the spouse's betrayal or sense of trauma was very, very deep. Mm-hmm. And it can almost feel like, man, that's a little out of sync. Well, that's their reality. Yeah. And then vice versa. I've worked with couples where his level of acting out is maybe quite severe, and her ability to be resilient to it, respond well, kind of deal with the trauma is maybe much, much higher because of other experiences in her life on a positive sense. And so she may not have as much trauma because she's more capable in that moment to receive it. And so we can't just determine the level of trauma based off of the level of behavior. And I think that's what a pastor might be struggling with, is in their mind of like, well, man, he was quote unquote only lusting after other women a time or two, or he only veered off on Facebook into images a couple of times, but he wasn't sleeping around. And so as pastors, yes, they've maybe dealt with those worst case scenarios where it's like, man, I've dealt with way, way worse. You guys can overcome this. Well, again, it's not about the level of behavior. It's assessing the level of how traumatic it is for her. And so that's where it all comes back to, we've got to be willing to listen. We've got to be willing to assess for her, how is this feeling? Because the truth is, however she's feeling, that is her reality.
Yeah,
and the only
absolutely.
place we can help her is in her reality.
Absolutely. That reminds me, Jenn, of the picture that you love to share when you lead groups, the "How Deep is the Mud" picture.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And we can put that in the show notes, but it shows a Labrador Retriever next to a little Chihuahua dog who have both been romping around in the
Right.
mud, and the mud is up to the Chihuahua's neck, but it's only up to the Labrador Retriever's knees. So how deep is the mud? It does depend on the perspective, and that has a lot to do with family of origin, background, and other traumas that we've experienced individually throughout our lives.
Yeah, this is also reminding me of the statement, if it's hysterical, it's historical. So something that has
That's
been a
good.
fantastic tool is, and well, if I'm in the right headspace, I apply this well. But if someone's response is really over the top, it's up to me to determine, or at least consider, that there's some history here, and to step back and not be so quick to step into a defensive statement. Well, not that we should ever really be quick to step into a defensive statement, but if it's hysterical, if the reaction's over the top, if we are going to be compassionate, if we are going to be empathetic, we have an opportunity in that moment to consider that there's some history here that they may not even be aware of, and that we most certainly are not aware of, and to exhibit compassion and empathy in that moment. Nick, everything that you said there actually hits some of the points that Kris and I had talked about, displaying sympathy, having levels of listening, and Kris, you talk about that frequently, and I love that. And then believing her reality.
Yes.
Trauma is what happens inside of us as a result of what happens outside of us, And then, of course, as pastors and as lay people and as just people of God in general,
Therapists,
asking the Holy Spirit to guide us in that moment is such an important piece of that.
Yeah. And I think being willing to ask questions like, can you help me understand what you're experiencing? Tell me about what you're feeling. Tell me about your day, what's happening. And I think when women start to describe, like, I can't eat, I can't sleep, I can't think straight, this is constantly on my mind, I'm obsessed with worry, fear, doubt, wondering what he's doing. As they describe that reality, I hope we're able to listen and go, wow, this is very serious for them. And whether I think the behavior on the other side merits that or not is in that moment inconsequential. Because in that moment, if anyone came to you and said, hey, I'm going through something where I can't eat, I'm not sleeping well, I can't think straight, I'm forgetful, I'm yelling at my kids, like, I don't care what the topic is, as a pastor, wouldn't our heart go out and say, man, how can we help you?
Yeah.
How can we support you? This sounds horrible. And whatever the event itself is, in that moment, is inconsequential to the care that woman needs.
There's power in the words, too, of I believe you and I'm so sorry.
Absolutely.
And then taking it from there. Okay. All right, Jenn.
All right, so our second statement comes from Jessica P. It says, after D-Day, my husband and I sat down with a trusted pastor and his wife. Although they did their best to be supportive, since they never had the experience of betrayal, their advice wasn't very helpful. We went to two different Christian counselors, both of whom told me, the betrayed spouse, that the answer was to discover what was missing in the marriage that caused my husband to cheat. I quickly realized their advice, was missing the mark too. I refused to take any responsibility for my husband's affairs. Finally, we found a counselor who was specifically trained in sexual addiction and betrayal trauma and had a solid plan for healing and recovery. Yeah, ouch is right. Ouch. Yeah. Have you heard of these kind of stories before, Nick? A statement like Jessica's?
Yeah, unfortunately, far too many where there is, and I don't know where it comes from, but I think in Christian circles there is kind of an expectation that if the marriage bed, let's put it that way, is frequently being visited, there's great sexual connection, that in that situation, a spouse won't struggle. And from everything we've learned about human behavior and the brain and how addiction works and neurochemicals, and all of this really connects really well with scripture if we want to talk about that, because I know for a pastor it can feel like, well, wait a minute, let's talk about the Bible. Well, if we just look at the way that our brain was designed by God to work, we know that that's simply not true, that sexual addiction and sexual struggles are not about sex itself. It's about how it's become attached to meeting a need and medicating pain and dealing with life. And so I have many, many stories of men in group who will say, man, our sex life in the marriage was fantastic. And I was going to strip clubs and acting out with prostitutes, which is, I mean, it's kind of mind blowing because it really disrupts that maybe paradigm we have that, well, if you have a healthy sex life at home, you won't stray. And even in our culture, there's a little bit of that. And it's just not true. And it's not, and it is absolutely true that we are not responsible for other people's decisions and their choices. Now, does what I do impact you? Does what I do impact my wife just like what she does impacts me? Sure. We all influence one another, but it is never appropriate for me to point to her or for her to point to me and say, well, I only did this because you did that. Well, I'm still responsible for my actions and my behaviors. And as soon as we start to put on someone else that it's your job to fix me or your job to fix someone else, I mean, what's kind of ironic to me in this whole situation is like, I can't think of any other area where we would suggest that. Like, well, if you were just a better, if you just prepared better beverages at home, he wouldn't be an alcoholic.
Yeah, wow.
Right? Like, that would sound so silly to us. Like, well, that's not what alcoholism is about. But we tend to think that sex is just about a quantity. As long as you're getting enough, you're good. And it's not at all. So, yeah, unfortunately, it's far too common. And I think it's rooted in some flawed paradigms that maybe were handed to us as pastors that we've never really appropriately evaluated.
Yeah. Oh, that is such a great example. And now my brain's trying to think of more. But so the second step in treating this traumatic wound is to stop the bleeding. And so what we're going to do is focus on the immediate need, not the marriage. And that was such a great example, Nick. Thank you for that. So we're going to avoid cause and effect thinking, which is the if-then that you just gave us an example, Nick. And then ask clarifying questions or permission questions. How are you feeling right now? And would you like to talk about it? What are your immediate concerns and priorities moving forward? Is there a particular way that I can support you during this difficult time? And have you considered seeking professional help, such as a therapist or betrayal coach, to navigate through this difficult time? So, as pastors, as clergy, even as coaches, we're not trained to fix the things, but we can certainly come alongside, support them and guide. So.
Yeah, your whole metaphor for this podcast is really appropriate because if someone went to, the emergency room because they'd broken their leg, you wouldn't work with them to say, well, here's how we're going to get you running again. Like, I want you to, run 4 miles a week. And like, if my leg is broken, the first priority is we've got to fix the leg. We can't talk about my other activities until the leg is at a place it can handle regrowth and building. And that's the reality for a woman or a betrayed spouse, is if they're in trauma, they are at a heightened level of arousal. And by arousal, we don't mean sexual arousal. We just mean that all of their systems are firing because at that very deep, innate part of us that we call our limbic system, the inner brain, it is responsible for survival. And it is asking all these questions like, am I safe? What do I need to do to protect myself? And if that system is firing, like helping someone build anything stable or long-term is just not possible in that moment. And so we have to assess and help understand, what does someone need to feel safe, to develop some security and stability? So there's all these S's, safe, secure. And Dr. Kurt Thompson talks about them, that we all have these needs to feel safe, seen, soothed, secure. And if we're outside of that window of tolerance, if we're outside of those areas where we don't feel seen or safe or soothed or secure, we're going to be making unhealthy, unwise choices. Mm-hmm. And so I would suggest to a pastor that if we're trying to help them rebuild the marriage too soon or forgive him too soon, we actually may inadvertently do more damage because they're making decisions outside of healthy, normal functioning of their brain. Mm-hmm. But if instead we recognize, man, you're at this really heightened state of fear and awareness of, what do I need for safety? We've got to do whatever we can to help calm those systems to bring you to a place where you feel like, I'm safe, I'm secure, My brain is calmed down. I've got the support I need. And that may be much longer than we expect, right? We might think that one good counseling session, we've got him there. It's like, no, this may be several months of helping a person find that place. And again, every situation is going to be different. For some, they may not feel safe if he's still in the house because the behavior they're perpetuating may be ongoing. And if there's constantly more pain coming, well, no growth can happen. And then in other marriages, she might say, well, I feel completely safe with him. I can see he's doing some work and he's repentant, but I have these other concerns. So it's, again, in every situation, that's what I think we can do as a pastor is assess, what can I do to stop the bleeding, to set the leg, to get the pain at least subsided enough that then at some point we can turn the corner and start to talk about regrowth and rebuilding. But that is a phase that needs to be really secondary to all of those immediate and more pressing needs.
You know, you mentioned forgiving too quickly. And it's always an interesting thing to hear that come from a pastor's mouth, because so frequently many of us are told to forgive quickly, but that it's biblical and that we are engaging in sin when we don't forgive quickly. Could you expound a little bit on what does that look like in this type of scenario, in applying this in a biblical sense? Because I do believe that we are to forgive and to forgive quickly, but at the same time, let's stay with the analogy here. We're in the ER. The first thing we're doing is not forgiving the person that ran us over with the car. We're dealing with the injury, and then we're moving toward it. But just from a biblical stance, Nick, could you explain a little bit about that, about the concept of forgiving too quickly versus what many of us have been taught about the biblical call to forgive quickly?
Yeah, I think, we could do a whole podcast on forgiveness and premature forgiveness.
Okay, I'll send you an email.
Yeah, it's important to think about what do we mean by forgiveness, that forgiveness does not mean saying what they did was okay. Forgiveness does not mean that I'm no longer hurting. Forgiveness does not mean that we're now in a restored relationship and everything is fine. All of those are more about reconciliation and recovery versus forgiveness. Forgiveness is more of removing myself from the seat of judgment against you and recognizing like that's God's job and not mine. And I'm releasing you from my debt, that you don't owe me for this. But that doesn't mean that then everything goes back to the way it was. And I think sometimes in our press for forgiveness, a struggling or addicted spouse is trying to get the spouse to say everything's okay and we're going to be fine. And they're maybe looking for those assurances, but they want it absent of any real work or recovery. And so if forgiveness is about me, removing myself from the seat of judgment against you and releasing that burden, then there are a couple other things that come to mind for me that I need to know what I'm forgiving.
Yes.
And in many of these situations, like when you're dealing with a spouse in trauma, it's because discovery has happened, right? Like you found something on his phone, a text came through, you caught him in the act, whatever it is, like stuff is blown up in the marriage. And the reality that we see at Pure Desire is I cannot think of a single situation in discovery where that was all of the information. There's been a history here. There's a story here. There's more that needs to be known. And so in some ways, it'd be far better to give that couple time to process through some recovery and what we call at Pure Desire, having some full disclosure of here's everything that's happened and here's it all laid out so that when there's forgiveness, it's complete and not partial. Because I think some couples get into this unhealthy rhythm of, oh yeah, I forgot about this. Okay, now I need to try to forgive again. Oh yeah, then there was this and I forgive again. And it's like, will this ever stop or ever end? And I feel like I have to forgive no matter what, versus if we know everything there is to forgive, well, then that forgiveness can take on a different flavor. And also, I think there has to be some readiness in my heart and mind to know that when I say I forgive you, I mean it, that I'm intentional and not just saying it because I'm supposed to. And one of the things I do try to remind people, I think when we discuss forgiveness from a biblical point of view of like, hey, we need to forgive or commanded to, we're kind of seeing forgiveness from God's point of view, that God can and does forgive immediately, because in every situation, God knows everything that's happened. Like there's nothing hidden from him. And God is a completely stabilized being that never has to navigate his emotions or get himself back under control before he forgives. So in any moment we go to him, we can lay it all out. And yes, immediately the forgiveness of God through Christ is ours. But none of us are God, right? None of us are Jesus. So we have more work to do maybe to get to that place where when I say I forgive you, it means something versus just kind of being a Band-Aid over a situation that actually may prevent us from doing some of the deeper work we need to do.
Yeah, so good. Yeah, fun fact, none of us are God, in case you didn't know.
And if we could remember that, we'd all be better off.
Yes, we would.
God does not need to deal with his family of origin issues or the bullying he experienced in junior high. Yeah. All right. That is so good. Thank you. The next quote that we have is from Becky O. And she shares, our pastor listened to our story. He was very compassionate and caring. However, it was really hard to process the way he responded. He praised my husband for being vulnerable and transparent. And then he told me I needed to forgive my husband. Great segue there. He said my husband needed a supportive wife and scolded me for being unforgiving and holding on to hurt. He communicated that forgiving my husband would empower him to make healthier choices. He just needs a wife who loves and respects him. He's already dealing with so much shame, he said. Then he walked me through an exercise of forgiveness right then and there in front of my husband. I was longing to be seen and for my pain to be acknowledged. I was in the depths of grief. It was so hard to go through that experience as I was sitting in so much hurt and heartache. It felt like another betrayal or a secondary trauma. And so step 3 for stabilizing this traumatic wound for this patient, or stabilizing the patient, is that we're going to bandage the wound and stabilize them. And in this scenario, we're going to educate her about the healing process that she is entering into. And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we, like I mentioned earlier, need to see this as a longer process. Maybe in pastoral ministry, especially as we were taught about counseling, we kind of see ourselves in a session or two walking a couple through a plan of forgiveness and restoration and being like, all right, you're good to go. Like, you forgave and Jesus healed you and we're all set. And the truth is, as I talked about, like, there's a process we need to walk through, and forgiveness definitely can and should be a part of that process, but it's definitely not the whole process, and it's not the upfront part of the process. I mean, in the story you read, man, I wonder how much time that pastor spent with the struggler or addict really assessing how sincerely did they feel repentant and how much had they understood the impact it had had on their spouse. How ready were they to acknowledge the level of their sin and completely deal with it and begin to take those steps, versus looking to the spouse as like, well, if you would just forgive, this will all get better. It's like, well, no, he's got some patterns he needs to deal with. Now, I think when we do work with someone on forgiveness, it's helpful to maybe change the language and not talk about forgiveness, but to process through a little more the negative impacts of bitterness and anger on our own soul.
That's good.
And so to try to help a betrayed spouse understand or figure out ways to deal with the natural anger and the expected bitterness they're going to feel. Mm-hmm. Because I think we do see stories, and you probably hear them, where the bitterness or the anger that the spouse feels can lead them so off course that they end up doing things that they later regret or have to work through, because in their anger, they went off into sin as well, or it just exacerbated the situation to a whole new level. And so there are dangers there, but expecting that forgiveness is the way to deal with that is probably the wrong tact, versus how can we help you understand this is hurtful, understand and learn about some healthy ways to deal with it, get you in a community of other women that have walked through this process and can help be maybe a holding place for your pain, because you do have pain and that pain needs to go somewhere. But we can either let that pain transform us, or we're going to transmit it onto someone else. And I think in a lot of stories we hear of betrayed spouses who recognize that their kids ended up getting a brunt of anger that they were feeling because of their spouse. And some of that is just they weren't educated on how much pain and anger I am feeling, and that it is normal and justified to feel this way, but that I do have options of how to deal with it. That I don't need to just stay stuck in it forever. I can have some community I go to. I can have places where I process that. And mean, that is to me the value of counseling. And that may not be with your pastor if this isn't their area of training and expertise, but having a counselor that can look you in the eye and say, I know where you're at. I know how angry you feel. And let's talk about why you're feeling that anger. And when that anger flares up, let's talk about some strategies of how you can deal with it and still stay present with your kids, or not, shipwreck other parts of your life. Because I think that's one of the most challenging things that a betrayed spouse feels, is this whole area of her life and her marriage blows up. But on the other hand, she still has to probably raise kids or have a job or take care of a home, or like they've got responsibilities, and all those other responsibilities don't just stop because they're going through all this pain and trauma. And so I think that's part of the healing process too, is say, let's come up with a game plan of how are you going to navigate life in the areas that you can't just quit being a mom. You can't just, in most situations, you probably can't just quit your job. So let's figure out a game plan. How do we make this workable so that you have the time and space to then heal and recover in? So I think those are some of the pieces, and just what we've been talking about, to help a spouse see that the healing process will first involve them dealing with the trauma in their life and getting to a place where they feel safe and stabilized, and that regrowing the marriage is not even entirely up to them. That what their spouse does is a big part of that, but that will come in secondary phases as they start to see more clearly what's happening in the marriage. So the other thing that we have found for a lot of spouses can be very helpful, and you do want to be thoughtful in how you bring this up, but many spouses have said how helpful it was to understand the addictive cycle of the brain and the neurochemical side, and that it did involve a history and a pattern of this, that it wasn't just that they weren't beautiful enough and he found more beautiful women. When they understand the neurochemical process of addiction, that can be helpful for them to kind of release themselves of some of the burden of, if I was only better, he wouldn't struggle. Now, as I said, you'd have to be careful how you bring that up, because I think I've heard stories where a pastor or a well-intentioned leader kind of brings it up to say, well, if you just understood addiction, you wouldn't feel bad.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, no, it still is tremendously hurtful and traumatic, but that brain understanding can create a little bit of depth of awareness that, okay, there's more going on here than my own, response or beauty that I bring to the marriage.
Yes, I'm really refraining from saying mic drop, Jen. That's kind of my key phrase that I say. I halfway restrained. I kind of said it, but not saying it.
You still snuck it in there. So, Nick, we have this thing where Kris always says mic drop, and I give her a really hard time because it happens almost every episode.
Because we have smart people on here. Good.
What I hear you say, Nick, is that it's really about counseling the person, not the problem, and coming alongside the person and not the problem. And that's the thing that Dan and I found at Pure Desire with our counselors there, was that Harry and Debbie, for the first time in our lives, approached us with relationship rather than trying to solve our problem. I love that. I would love to have you touch just momentarily on some of those keys to trusting again. I know that at Pure Desire, you talk about sincerity, ability, durability. Briefly, can you touch on those three just as a guide towards starting to move towards that trust again?
And part of that healing process.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's just the point, that in the healing process, there are kind of two sides. There's your own need, or the spouse's need for healing, and then the marriage. And those two may not happen concurrently depending on the response of the addicted or struggling spouse. And so, just like you said, the betrayed spouse is looking for sincerity initially. Like, do they get that this is a big deal? Mm-hmm. Are they truly repentant? Are they just saying they're sorry? Or do I see in their countenance and in their responses that they are truly sorry, and that they're grieving how much they've hurt me or ruined, brought rupture into our marriage? So that sincerity starts to give a spouse hope that, they see. And I remember my wife saying that, like, I felt like for the first time, you get it. You get how much this is hurting me.
What a gift.
Well, sincerity is only a first step, because then we need to show some ability, because I think I'd been sincere many times in our marriage, but hadn't shown any ability to change. And so if all we do is sincere and then we just keep going through the same cycle, over time, that's going to wear a spouse out, and they may quit, because it's just like nothing is changing. So that we need to see there's some ability to change. And that's things like he's going to group, he's seeing a counselor, he's changing the way he uses the internet or his phone or his computer, he's changing the way he interacts with coworkers or people of the opposite sex. That's that's showing some ability to change. And then durability, the third piece, is just to keep doing those things for long enough that the spouse sees, oh, this is a new normal. This isn't just him making a few changes until I'm no longer mad and then going back to the old patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And that stability and durability may take years. That's where we talk about it being a 3 to 5 year process. That doesn't mean he should be relapsing for 3 to 5 years, but it does mean it may be 3 to 5 years until that trust level comes all the way back up to where it was before discovery in the marriage.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you, Nick. All right. The next step is treating for shock. And in this case, that would be equivalent of normalizing the experience. So, Jenn, would you read the quote from Sarah?
Yeah. I called my pastor and his wife immediately after discovering my husband's betrayal, just asking for support, reeling in hurt, shock, and fear. I was clueless on what to even do next to get through the day. They responded calmly, which helped my brain to recognize that my house was not physically on fire and I was not about to experience imminent death I was feeling. They took the sin seriously and tried not to sugarcoat my husband's behavior or coach me into some false immediate forgiveness. They sat with us for hours in a park and said the hard things to us both. However, they did not know enough about sexual addiction to help us recognize what we were up against. We wasted years seeking answers and support in the wrong places for the wrong issues.
Mm-hmm. So with normalizing the experience, some of the points we had were providing a community of other recovering mentors or couples that will minimize isolation, minimize emotional flooding, help her effectively deal with embarrassment, and provide a safe community that speaks the same language. And then next, we want to help her deal with her emotions and emphasize that healing is not a linear process. It's kind of miraculous when it is. It's the exception, not the rule.
Right, right. And I think, my son's a pastor, and I would hope that anyone that would come to him, he would have this ability to step into all these things that we have talked about so far. But even the greatest pastors don't necessarily know everything. That even doctors, that they're specialists for reasons. Not every doctor can know everything, and so that's why we really want to push people toward or encourage them to consider people who understand sexual betrayal, people who understand sex addiction. And we'll get into that here at the end as we wrap up a little bit about what a CSAT is, what a PSAP is, what betrayal trauma is, and some avenues to move toward in that. But understanding, there's a term, when in doubt, refer out. I would hope that myself, as well as anyone else who may not be an expert on, I just smiled because I'm really probably not an expert on a lot of things, but for those who aren't an expert in a field, to recognize that and to have the ability to refer out to those who are an expert in that field. My son is fantastic. He's walked with my husband. He hasn't walked with us, but he's watched us walk out this process, and he is a great resource. But I hope that he, myself, anybody else would know that when we are at that point to where we don't have the education that we might need to walk someone through, that we would refer that out to someone like, the counselors at Pure Desire and whatnot as well. So when we're talking about helping people, I think that's an important aspect to really consider, that this is what this couple needed from Sarah. They needed the right people in the right place and time.
Yeah, and can we just say that if you are a male pastor, you are not the right person to walk a female betrayed spouse through recovery.
You can say mic drop now.
Oh yeah, that was a mic drop.
You can help. You can be a bridge. You can provide some direction. But long term, unless you are a certified counselor in this area, that's not going to be your primary role. And how valuable is it to get a betrayed spouse into a group with other betrayed spouses, being led like through a Pure Desire group or others that have curriculum that have been tried and tested over years to understand a pathway of healing that women are walking through together with a leader that kind of gets the process. That's going to be so much more transformative than maybe us as a male pastor thinking our background in theology and preaching is somehow going to be enough to get them to recovery. So I think if we can find humility in that, to just say, it's okay that I'm not the healing answer for every person that comes to me, but I could be a bridge to the healing they need. And here's something else to think about. Most betrayed spouses probably don't know initially that those resources even exist. That's something we hear all the time at Pure Desire, is betrayed spouses who will say, I had no idea groups like this even existed. When my husband acted out, I just went to Google and started typing in to try to find, what can I do? So your church may have connections to great counselors or groups. You may even have a group meeting in your church, but I would bet the vast majority of women in your church have no idea they exist, because part of it is, until we need it, we don't even think about it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I see advertisements all the time that I never remember. Why? Because it's advertising something I don't want or need. But if my car breaks down, suddenly I'm like, I'm aware of every mechanic ad, special that's out there, discount, because I need it. And that's where betrayed spouses are at. They need care. And if they come to you, a big part of your role is, here's all the resources we have. Here's all the connections we have. And if as a pastor you realize, boy, we don't have many. Well, that's step number one, is figure out what resources are in your community. Get connected to Pure Desire. Find counselors you trust that have been certified in this area. Take them out to lunch and ask about their approach, so that when a betrayed spouse comes to you, you say, man, I have met so-and-so across town, and she is fantastic in this area. I would love to recommend you meet with her. So all of that helps. And the other thing I just wanted to say quickly, since part of treating for shock, you say, is normalize the experience. One of the things we most commonly hear from men when they're stuck in their struggle is, I thought I was the only one. Because they come to church and they see all these people that look normal and act fine, like, why does nobody else struggle? And then when it comes up and it's revealed that, like, man, a lot of us struggle, the way a guy will say, it felt so great to know I wasn't alone. Well, let's consider that betrayed spouse has the exact same need. Because when they find out their husband's struggling, they're asking all those same questions. What's wrong with our marriage? Why are we the only ones? I must be the only spouse going through this. And when they can find community with other women who've had that experience, the way it takes them out of isolation is a huge part of the healing experience. So creating that environment where those spouses learn, I'm not alone, and even saying that to them in that first session of, like, you are not alone. You're not the only one. This is happening far more than we realize. And sure, we don't talk about it on Sunday morning, because that wouldn't be appropriate to bring couples up and say, oh, Joe and Sally are going through, infidelity in their marriage. A lot of it does happen under the radar, but I want you to know, as your pastor, this is coming up all the time, and you are not the only couple. It's very hard what you're going through, but you're not alone, and you're not the only ones. And we have a plan. We have resources to help you. That's so valuable.
There's that adage that a failure to have a plan is a plan to fail.
Yeah.
And so it's just like having a fire escape plan for your home. I encourage clergy, pastors, whatever, coaches, to have a plan. I love that, Nick, to be educated on what's out there. And I love that Anne Voskamp, I think that's how you say her last name, quote, that shame dies when stories are shared in safe places. And that was just so comforting, even for me, to hear you say that, Nick, that what you said about, you're not alone. This happens. I'm well versed in this, and we got you. We're going to take you through. What a gift that would be on D-Day, or the weeks following.
Yeah.
Okay. So the next quote we have is from Megan, and she says, I have often felt rushed in recovery just so I can be, quote, spiritual again. After just 3 months, I was told I was bitter, simply because I was still hurting so badly. We didn't come across a solid recovery program until 6 months into Betrayal. I am so thankful we finally did, but how much healthier would it have been if we could have had the right help in those first few days and weeks? I'm not sure if it's because this has hit me personally, but infidelity seems to have a new face. God-fearing, Jesus-loving men and women end up in affairs. The church desperately needs to be educated on the trauma of it all. And I couldn't agree with her more. So the fifth step out of 6 here of supporting this person who's suffered a traumatic wound is to support the injury. And that just flows into what we were just talking about, is offering support. And offering support comes in the form of resources, such as offer groups. There are specific groups for men. There are specific groups for women. I know Pure Desire has excellent material. Love it. 7 Pillars and Betrayal and Beyond. I know Pure Life Alliance has, I can't think of the men's group right now, but Healing Hurt for the women. Bethesda Workshops has great groups. There's on and on and on. So there's wonderful groups out there, books, therapy, coaching, podcasts like this one. So if you're listening, good job finding your resources, and some great devotionals, etc. So let's talk about that for a second. Nick, you just touched on what it looks like for a pastor in the beginning of this as a first responder to offer support. Any other thoughts come to mind or resources?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to remember that when a spouse is in this place, it's all consuming, and they are hungry and desperate for information. And so if we just have kind of one, well, I just refer them to this one article. Well, that may be a good starting point, but it's good to have kind of a library, a bit of a war chest in mind of here's 2 or 3 podcasts we recommend, here's several books, here's a couple of authors that we trust, here's groups we're aware of. And if you can provide that, that doesn't mean they have to do all of them. But I think sometimes the abundance of resources is part of the way we communicate. This is important to us. Because if we come across as like, well, I don't know a whole lot about this. I've heard of one book. I've never really read it, but someone said it was good once. That kind of leaves, I think, the betrayed spouse feeling I'm on my own to figure this out. And I'm not trying to say a pastor needs to become an expert. I do think it is helpful if we educate ourselves on some of the neurochemistry of the brain. I mean, Dr. William Struthers from Wheaton College wrote a great book called Wired for Intimacy. I believe every pastor should read that. Jay Stringer wrote a great book about our desires called Unwanted, and helping understand where these desires come from, that they're not random. It's not just a man's problem. And so we can educate ourselves, but I don't say we need to be an expert. I do think, though, we need to have a wide array of resources that communicates to the couple and the betrayed spouse just what you said earlier, Kris. We got you. Here's resources that we have vetted, that we trust. And if we don't feel like we have those, I do think that's our responsibility as a pastor. And the other thing I might add to it is, if you don't think that's you, like if you don't have the bandwidth to learn about some of that, you need to find another pastor on your staff or a lay leader that you trust, that you feel is the expert, and quickly involve them. I had a wonderful partner in ministry when I was a pastor. My women's ministry director, Pastor Ann, was so compassionate in ways that I wasn't, was so connected to the counseling community. And I will tell you, I never met with a woman or a couple without bringing Ann in, just because I knew all of the resources that I hadn't read, Ann had read them. And she could do all of that. So I could still provide kind of that pastoral voice. Being the senior pastor, for some people that meant a lot, that Nick met with us. But if I had Ann there as kind of she's got all these other pieces, not only did it, I think, help the woman feel supported because there's now another woman in the room, it just created that connection to all those resources. So that the summary there to say, if you don't have all that connection and don't have time to create it, find someone in your church that already has that expertise and pull them in as often as possible.
We were sitting here listening to all these quotes that we have shared today, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, the role of a pastor, it's got, and as rewarding as it is and must be, there must be so much weight that is put on a pastor's shoulders. I remember going to my pastor when I had discovered my first husband's pornography addiction, and looking back, it was a hurtful experience. But now that I look back at it with almost 20 years hindsight, I'm like, oh my goodness, that poor guy. Like all the things that have come his way, and all the pressure that was on him to be all things to all people. Even as a betrayed spouse, I think there's room to really consider that pastors are human too. and we have the same Holy Spirit in us that pastors have in them. And sometimes I think we expect our pastors to really not have anything personal going on, not have any of their own struggles, even though the statistics said differently. We read that at the beginning. I think sometimes, just as a listener, somebody who's listening today, let's remember that we're all trying to do life together. And pastors, while a lot of these quotes have been really hurtful, my guess is that they haven't been intentional. And so if you have been hurt, if you've been hurt by someone in your church or someone in leadership in your church, specifically your pastor, please keep in mind that they're doing most of the time, they're doing the best they can with what they know. And as with any of us, we do the best we can with what we know until we know better than we do better, right? So just kind of a word out there that was just put on my heart right now. I'm like, oh my gosh, these pastors absorb a lot of trauma and a lot of things that come their way that they may not be equipped for. And not that we're in charge of that for them. We're not in charge of their inner world or what they're going through, but certainly something to consider when approaching and when we've experienced hurt from them. They're human too, you know?
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. These are definitely, hopefully, are rarer cases, the exception, not the rule, but that's what we're wanting to move toward, is for all of us to be better equipped.
Yeah.
So the sixth and final step to how to treat this traumatic wound is, if the wound is too severe, call 911, ask for help. So refer out to trained personnel. So we're going to talk about CSATs and APSATs and all these acronyms here in just a second. But first, Jenn, would you read that final testimony that was shared with us?
All right. When I went to my pastor 2 years ago, our new marriage, asking for guidance, and I'm going to start that over.
Okay.
When I went to my pastor 2 years ago into our new marriage, asking for guidance and help with my husband's porn or sex addiction problem, he listened to me through my tears as I poured out my husband's betrayals with porn and other women via Facebook. After I was done, he tried to minimize my pain by saying he had a Facebook account himself, and he had friends, quote unquote friends, who were female that he would message, and that maybe I was misunderstanding my husband's intentions with these other women. He said he would talk with my husband about it and that maybe marriage counseling would be helpful for us. Like it was more of a marriage issue than a sex addiction issue of my husband's. I walked out of my pastor's office that day feeling hurt and angry. I felt hopeless, like my pastor doesn't see it as a total betrayal of our marriage and an addiction problem of my husband. If he doesn't see that, who will? That was from Kendall.
Yeah. Yep. So who do we refer out to? Who are the trained personnel we're referring to? Nick, what do you have to offer there?
Yeah, I think this whole area requires a humility on our part as pastors to embrace what we've already talked about, that I don't have to be the expert on everything in order to help people. And I know in several situations, the tact that I would take would be to say to someone, hey, I'm here for you. I want you to know I'm going to pray with you. I can provide support. I can point you back to Christ and his presence with us, and that he never leaves us, never forsakes us. I can provide some of that spiritual care for you as long as is needed. But I've not had experience like with the legal situation that you're in, to your story, Jenn. I've not had experience in really being trained in walking through infidelity. And so like I said, I can support you and pray for you, but I'd really encourage you to begin meeting with someone that this is their area of expertise. It's kind of like we use illustration. My mom was a career nurse, and she gets a lot of the phone calls from us of, hey, Nurse Rhonda, what do we do about this? And she's got great general ideas and directions, but there are points she's got, Nick, you guys need to go talk to a doctor, right? Mm-hmm. So when she knows like, hey, this sounds a little more serious, that's why you got a doctor, Nick. Go meet, find your doctor. Yeah. And then sometimes we go to the doctor, right? And what does he say? Like, I can help you, here's some medicine. But other times he says, you need to go to a specialist because I'm trained, but I'm not trained in that to the level you need. I need you to go talk to, someone in, a bone doctor. I'm forgetting what they're called, an ortho. Anyway, people know all the names out there. So in situations like this as a pastor, we may have training in some areas. And I think it's okay to say, I'm trained in this. I'm trained to love you and help you find Christ. But I'm not trained in divorce and the aftermath of that, and separation plans and parenting plans. But I know some great counselors that do a lot of this work. Let me get you connected to them. And to realize that's actually a gift to someone. Because like I mentioned, they're not aware of that community, maybe to the degree that you are. And if there's someone you trust, that can be a great starting point, because they're just looking at a phone book going, well, what counselor do I call? what professional do I even start with? And so if we can provide those resources, that helps. We do recommend looking up someone that is a certified sex addiction therapist. For counselors, that's the official designation you can get from ITAP, which is, there's an acronym for everything in counseling.
Yes.
That's the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals that are kind of leading the way in sexual addiction recovery and understanding all the facets of that. And they give a CSAT label to counselors, or a PSAP is a pastoral sex addiction professional. That's a pastor that has done some of the initial training to help be that bridge into professional care. I would mention there's a Christian group called CSASI that has begun certifying some Christian counselors in the area of sexual addiction and recovery. So you could look for CSASI, CSASI, and I don't have off the top of my head what their acronym is for, but they're another group that we trust. And then the group APSATS works a lot with betrayed spouses. APSATS, you can look for someone that's been APSATS trained, because that's some significant betrayed spouse focused training that they've been given. And on either of those websites, on the ITAP website or APSATS, and hopefully you put all this in your show notes since no one's trying to write this down while driving, or they're falling off the treadmill trying to write a note. If you go to those websites, you can actually find their referrals to people in your area that may have those credentials. So that's always a great place to check.
And APSAT stands for the Association of Partners of Sex Addicts Trauma Specialists. So CSATs are specifically trained for more towards the addict, and the APSATs side is more trained to the betrayed spouse to support them. And, they co-communicate and cross-train there, but that's what their specialties are. Anything else you'd like to add to that, Jenn?
I would love for Nick to maybe highlight a little bit about what Pure Desire does. What do you have to offer? What does the organization have to offer the sex addict as well as the betrayed spouse?
Yeah, we offer counseling for both couples and individuals. So we often get betrayed spouses who call and the husband has either left or is unwilling to begin counseling, and we can begin working directly with them on a female basis. We do match up genders. Or if the couple is doing counseling, we counsel couples as couples. So that's kind of a unique distinctive of our ministry, that the husband and wife are both going to have a male-female advocate in the room with them, or on the virtual Zoom room, to create that plan as a couple. And we just find that's tremendously effective when a husband and wife can be meeting with a male-female team. And we've been doing that for 20 years at Pure Desire. And then we have a network of recovery groups, either online or in person at churches. And you can find all that at the puredesire.org website. If you search for groups, or I need a group, we've got a button all over the website about groups, and that'll take you to the two paths of either online or in person. And you could find a Betrayal and Beyond group for the wives, or a 7 Pillars group for the men. And then we also have, if women are the ones that are struggling with addictive behavior, we have groups called Unraveled for women that are walking through maybe their own addictive behaviors to overcome. So yeah, the two wings for us are kind of groups and counseling, and we find that actually both work together really well, because counselors provide that high-level professional care, and the group provides that community of peers that you need as you walk the journey through your recovery.
That's fantastic. Nick, could you share one more thing? You guys have an annual summit that is in person. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is? And I'm assuming you might have dates already going. We're in 2024, but just to give that resource out to people where they might want to come in person and experience
or virtually.
Or virtually, you're right. Yes.
Yeah, in person or live streaming. We've added that. So that is the middle weekend of September 20th and 21st. You can come in person here and join us in Troutdale, just outside of Portland. And by the way, September in Portland is the fall and love month. I warn you, if you come to Portland in the fall, you're going to think the whole world should move here, because it's beautiful. So it is a great trip. Or if you want to join online, you can get a virtual pass. And yeah, it's going to be great. We have Dr. Nancy Piercy coming, the author of Love Thy Body, Pastor Josh Broom, who was a former porn star and is now a pastor. And his story
awesome.
Is compelling. And yeah, he's going to do some great stuff on the just our identity and finding our identity in Christ. And then We also plan to be releasing a report that we've been doing with Barna, the Barna Group, on brand new stats about porn use and the church. And so plan to hear from president of their organization, David Kinnaman, is on our speaking list as well as myself and some of the PD team. So
nice.
Would love to have you join us September 20 and 21 for the PD Summit.
Yeah.
Excellent. I will plan to be there.
Me too.
I'm looking forward to that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nick. I would love to close this up with a quote from a pastor that actually blessed me so deeply that I don't think even to this moment that I can read this completely without crying. So bear with me. We're going to get vulnerable here, listeners. There might be some sniffles and tears, but this wasn't said directly to me. This was on a podcast, and I can't tell you how many people I've shared this with. So this pastor said, speaking of validating and believing her, he said, "It's fair to expect your spouse has eyes only for you. It doesn't matter how sexualized our culture has become. It is fair. I believe a God-given desire in a marriage relationship to say, I want to be the only one you look at or see in that way." And there's the tears. So don't buy into the cultural garbage that says that's just what guys do, or boys will be boys, sowing their wild oats. It is fair for you, betrayed spouse, to expect that you will be honored by your husband's thoughts and actions. I'm so grateful for that quote. Whew. Because I heard that in the first 3 weeks of my betrayal experience, and I hung on to that like a life raft, and that quote's from Nick Stumbo. So thank you, Nick, for being there for me.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Nick, did you know that was you?
I'm like, that sounds like the way I talk. I wonder if that's me.
Yeah.
Whew, I got through that. Sorry, not sorry, listeners, for the tears. But, 5 years into our recovery story, and ours has turned out so well, that still just, that hit my deep need. And still is so validating. So thank you for your pastoral direction in that, Nick. It really helped me.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's for all of us, it's a beautiful invitation to honor the vows we make at our weddings, right? Because we say forsaking all others. And in that moment, I think we know that doesn't just mean physically. Like, forsaking all others means you're going to be my one and only. And if I'm struggling to live that out, I need to do the work I need to do so that I can bring that to the marriage. And that's, when we accept that I'm just trying to honor the vows I made at the beginning, that can be a game changer for the struggler to see I need to be sincere about my recovery.
Yeah.
100%. And God takes those vows seriously, and it is a covenant relationship. We're not entering into a contract. It's a covenant, and it's serious. So, okay. Nick, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
We've been looking forward to this, and we knew that you were the exact right person for this conversation.
Yeah.
So, on that note, listeners, thank you for tuning in and being a part of our podcast community. Your support is so valuable to us, and we are here to support you. In fact, we'd love to hear from you, and you can reach us at the BRTpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll put that in the show notes as well with the contact information for Pure Desire and the summit and all that good stuff. So please be sure to like, subscribe, rate the show. It helps others to find us. It changes that algorithm to help others find their way here, and we'll see you back here soon. Thanks, everybody.
See you next time.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Betrayal, Recovery, Transformation Podcast with your hosts, Kris Rocha and Jenn Howie. We hope you've been helped and encouraged. If you value the content we shared today, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review. This helps others find the show. Need personalized guidance? Please contact Kris or Jenn for transformative coaching. This episode has been brought to you by HealingWithTheHowies.com, WatermarkCoach.com, and with the support of Pure Life Alliance Ministries.